Vincenzo Marcello stood at the altar of Chicago's most opulent cathedral, his tailored Armani suit fitting perfectly across his broad shoulders, his dark hair swept back with precision, his cold, steel-gray eyes scanning the assembled crowd with practiced authority. At 42 years old, he commanded the city's most powerful crime family with an iron fist and calculated ruthlessness. Today was meant to be his coronation, not just a wedding, but a public declaration of power, a statement that he had ascended to heights unimaginable even 5 years ago. Beside him stood Clarissa Monroe, 28 years old, blonde, beautiful in a calculated way, her designer wedding gown worth more than most people earned in a year. She was the daughter of a prominent politician connected to old money families on the East Coast, exactly the kind of trophy wife that solidified Vincenzo's position among Chicago's criminal elite. Their union was strategic, political, a merger of power and influence disguised as romance. But Vincenzo's mind was not on his bride. His thoughts were consumed with the guest he had specifically invited, the woman whose presence at this wedding would deliver the most exquisite form of revenge he had orchestrated in years. 7 years ago, Vincenzo had been married to Gabriella Torres, a woman he now remembered with contempt and bitter satisfaction at how thoroughly he had destroyed her. Their marriage had been a mistake born from momentary weakness, a lapse in judgment during his early 30s when he had foolishly believed that genuine connection mattered more than strategic advantage. Gabriella had been nothing when he met her, a community college graduate working as an event coordinator for a small catering company. She had been beautiful in an unsophisticated way, with warm brown eyes, dark cascading hair, and a smile that had momentarily made him forget about empires and territories and the cold calculations that defined his world. He had married her in a small ceremony, kept her separate from his business operations, and for 18 months had maintained the illusion that he could have both a criminal empire and a normal domestic life. The illusion had shattered when Vincenzo's ambitions expanded and his need for strategic alliances became paramount. Gabriella did not fit into the world he was building. She embarrassed him at important gatherings with her lack of sophistication. She asked too many questions about his business. She spoke about morality and ethics in ways that made his associates uncomfortable. Most damningly, she represented everything he needed to leave behind to ascend to true power. So he had divorced her with calculated cruelty. He remembered the night he told her their marriage was over, remembered choosing each word specifically to wound and diminish. He had called her beneath him, inadequate, an embarrassment he had tolerated long enough. He remembered her tears, her desperate pleas, her pathetic attempts to salvage what they had built together. He had felt nothing but contempt watching her fall apart, felt satisfaction in demonstrating that he was capable of discarding anything that no longer served his purposes. What made his current triumph even sweeter was that Gabriella had been pregnant when he divorced her. She had tried to tell him the night he ended their marriage, but he had walked out before she could finish speaking. Later, when she attempted to contact him through lawyers, he had his attorneys deliver a message so brutal it ensured she would never approach him again. He wanted nothing to do with her or any offspring she might produce. The child, if it existed, was her problem and her punishment for having been stupid enough to marry someone so far above her station. For 7 years, Vincenzo had heard nothing from Gabriella Torres. She had vanished completely from his world, which he assumed meant she had crawled back to whatever poverty-stricken neighborhood she had originated from, probably raising his unwanted child in squalor while working minimum-wage jobs. The thought brought him dark satisfaction. He had moved on to build an empire while she had presumably descended into the irrelevance she deserved. But 3 months ago, Vincenzo had learned something that transformed his wedding from a mere power play into an opportunity for spectacular revenge. Through his extensive network of informants and connections, he discovered that Gabriella Torres had not descended into poverty and obscurity. Instead, she had built something that made Vincenzo's blood boil with rage and wounded pride. Gabriella had started a luxury event planning company called Stellar Occasions that had become wildly successful, particularly among Chicago's elite circles that Vincenzo himself inhabited. She coordinated charity galas, corporate events, high society weddings, and political fundraisers. Her client list included several families that Vincenzo did business with, politicians he had in his pocket, and socialites who attended the same gatherings he did. Somehow, the woman he had discarded as worthless had clawed her way into respectability and success. What made it worse was discovering that Gabriella had given birth not to one child, but to twin daughters who were now 6 years old. According to the information Vincenzo gathered, the girls attended an expensive private school, lived in a beautiful home in one of Chicago's better neighborhoods, and were being raised with every advantage. Gabriella had somehow transformed his rejection into motivation for success, which Vincenzo found personally offensive. The idea for inviting Gabriella to his wedding had come to him in a moment of cruel inspiration. He would send her an embossed invitation to watch him marry Clarissa Monroe, to witness his triumph and her irrelevance, to remind her that he had moved on to someone infinitely more appropriate while she remained forever tainted by his rejection. He wanted her to see what she had lost, to understand how completely he had surpassed whatever minor success she thought she had achieved. Vincenzo had his secretary call Gabriella's company and request her presence at the wedding, not as a planner, but as an honored guest. He wanted her sitting in the cathedral, watching him pledge himself to a woman of actual worth and breeding, surrounded by the kind of people who would never accept someone like Gabriella as an equal. It would be the perfect revenge, public and humiliating, without Vincenzo having to say a single word. Now, standing at the altar as the organist began playing the processional music, Vincenzo scanned the assembled guests with predatory anticipation. His associates filled the pews, men who controlled territories and commanded respect through fear and violence. Clarissa's family occupied the opposite side, politicians and businessmen whose corruption was hidden behind respectable facades. Everyone who mattered in Chicago's complex ecosystem of power and influence had come to witness Vincenzo Marcello's triumph. And somewhere in that crowd, if his plan had worked, sat Gabriella Torres, about to watch the man who had destroyed her marry someone infinitely superior. The thought brought Vincenzo a satisfaction more intense than any business victory. This was personal, intimate revenge, the kind that fed his ego in ways that money and territory never could. He had broken her once, and now he would break her again, simply by demonstrating how little she had ever mattered. The cathedral doors opened and the bridesmaids began their measured walk down the aisle. Vincenzo kept his expression appropriately solemn, but internally he was calculating exactly where Gabriella was sitting, imagining her face as she watched his wedding, envisioning her pain and humiliation. He had invited her to destroy whatever pride she might have rebuilt, to remind her that she would never escape the shadow of having been inadequate for him. But when the doors opened wider to reveal the assembled guests fully, Vincenzo's breath caught in his throat. There, 3 rows from the front on the bride's side, in a section typically reserved for distinguished guests, sat a woman who looked like Gabriella but somehow completely transformed. She wore an elegant emerald green dress that probably cost more than the entire wardrobe she had owned during their marriage. Her hair was styled with sophisticated simplicity, her makeup subtle but expertly applied. Diamond earrings caught the light, real stones, not costume jewelry, worth at least $20,000 from what Vincenzo could assess. But what stopped Vincenzo's heart cold was not Gabriella's transformed appearance. It was the 2 small girls sitting on either side of her, identical twins, with dark hair and delicate features, wearing matching sophisticated dresses that coordinated with their mother's outfit. The girls sat with perfect posture, their young faces composed and attentive, clearly well-mannered and beautifully raised. They looked like they belonged in this cathedral, like they were accustomed to attending high society events, like they had been raised with privilege and refinement. Gabriella was not shrinking in her seat or looking devastated or showing any sign of the humiliation Vincenzo had anticipated. Instead, she sat with quiet confidence, occasionally leaning down to whisper something to one of the twins, her expression serene and completely unbothered by her surroundings. She looked successful, composed, and most infuriatingly, she looked happy. This was not the broken woman Vincenzo had expected to see. This was someone who had transformed pain into power, rejection into resilience. Vincenzo's attention was yanked back to the ceremony as Clarissa began her walk down the aisle. He forced himself to focus on his bride, on the strategic alliance this marriage represented, on the power consolidation this union would achieve. But his eyes kept drifting back to Gabriella and those two little girls, his daughters, children he had never wanted and never acknowledged, sitting 3 rows away, looking like they had never needed him at all. The ceremony proceeded with traditional formality. Vincenzo recited his vows with appropriate solemnity, slipped the wedding ring onto Clarissa's finger with practiced ease, and kissed his new wife with calculated passion when the priest pronounced them married. The assembled guests erupted in applause, and Vincenzo led Clarissa back down the aisle, past rows of Chicago's most powerful and dangerous individuals, past politicians and businessmen and criminals, all celebrating his triumph. As they passed the row where Gabriella sat, Vincenzo made the mistake of making direct eye contact with his ex-wife. She met his gaze with completely calm composure. No tears, no visible pain, just steady acknowledgement that she had witnessed his wedding and remained entirely unaffected. One of the twins, the girl sitting on Gabriella's right, looked up at her mother, and then at Vincenzo passing by, her young face curious but completely secure in her mother's protective presence. The reception was held in the cathedral's adjacent hall, a space transformed into something resembling a palace with crystal chandeliers, imported flowers, and enough expensive champagne to intoxicate everyone in attendance. Vincenzo moved through the crowd, accepting congratulations, his arm around Clarissa's waist, projecting the image of a powerful man celebrating his perfect union. But his mind was elsewhere, consumed with unwelcome thoughts of Gabriella and the fact that his revenge plan had somehow backfired spectacularly. He had expected to see her broken and diminished. Instead, she appeared successful and content. He had wanted to demonstrate his superiority. Instead, he found himself unsettled by how completely she seemed to have moved beyond needing his validation. Worst of all were those 2 little girls, evidence that his rejection had not destroyed Gabriella, but had apparently motivated her to build something substantial without him. Vincenzo excused himself from a conversation with one of Clarissa's father's political associates and made his way to where he had seen Gabriella standing near the refreshment table. She was helping the twins select small pastries, her attention focused entirely on her daughters, seemingly oblivious to the spectacle unfolding around her. Up close, Vincenzo could see details that reinforced his unwelcome realization that she had genuinely transformed her life. Her dress was haute couture, not department store fashion. Her jewelry was authentic and expensive. Her shoes were designer, probably Italian, worth more than most people spent on an entire outfit. Everything about her presentation suggested genuine wealth and success. Not someone pretending to belong, but someone who actually did belong in these sophisticated circles. The twins were equally well presented, their dresses clearly expensive, their manners impeccable as they thanked their mother politely for the pastries she handed them. Gabriella looked up and saw Vincenzo approaching. Her expression did not change. No visible reaction to his proximity, no nervousness or discomfort, or any sign that seeing him affected her emotionally. She simply met his eyes with the same calm composure she had shown in the cathedral, waiting to see what he would say. Beside her, the twins noticed the tall man in the expensive suit approaching and moved slightly closer to their mother in protective instinct. Vincenzo found himself momentarily at a loss for words. a rare experience for a man who commanded rooms through sheer force of personality and implied threat. He had rehearsed this confrontation in his mind, imagined the satisfaction of seeing Gabriella's face crumble as he reminded her of her inadequacy, planned exactly how he would twist the knife of his rejection one more time. But faced with her actual presence, her obvious success, and those two little girls watching him with curious eyes, all his prepared cruelty felt suddenly hollow. Gabriella spoke first, her voice steady and professional, the tone of someone addressing a casual acquaintance rather than an ex-husband who had destroyed her 7 years ago. She congratulated him on his marriage with words that sounded genuine, wished him well with what seemed like honest sincerity, and made no reference to their shared past or his brutal rejection. It was a masterclass in dignity, in refusing to give power to someone who had once held all the power, in demonstrating through simple composure that she had moved completely beyond needing anything from him. One of the twins, emboldened by her mother's calm, looked up at Vincenzo with the fearless curiosity of a 6-year-old child and asked if he was her mother's friend from a long time ago. The question was innocent, delivered with the straightforward honesty of childhood, but it landed like a physical blow. Vincenzo looked down at the little girl, at her dark eyes that were somehow familiar, at features that might have resembled his own if he allowed himself to acknowledge the biological connection, and found himself completely unable to respond. Gabriella smoothly intervened, explaining to her daughter that he was someone she had known years ago, but that they had both moved on to different lives. Her explanation was neutral, devoid of bitterness or accusation, simply stating facts without emotional weight. The twin accepted this with a small nod and returned her attention to the pastry she was eating, already losing interest in the tall man who had approached her mother. To this child, Vincenzo was nothing more than a passing stranger, utterly irrelevant to her life and her world. The realization hit Vincenzo like ice water. He had orchestrated this entire confrontation to demonstrate his power over Gabriella, to prove that rejecting her had been the right choice, to humiliate her by showing how far he had risen while she presumably remained in the gutter where he had thrown her. Instead, he stood in his own wedding reception, surrounded by his allies and his new strategic marriage, feeling somehow diminished by a woman who had simply chosen to move forward with grace and dignity. Gabriella made polite excuses about needing to get the twins home, as it was past their bedtime. She thanked him again for the wedding invitation with impeccable manners that suggested she understood exactly why he had invited her and had chosen to attend anyway, on her own terms, refusing to be diminished by his attempt at revenge. She gathered her daughters, collected their small evening bags with practiced maternal efficiency, and prepared to leave his wedding reception exactly as she had arrived, completely self-possessed and utterly unbothered by his presence or his power. As Gabriella turned to lead the twins toward the exit, one of the girls looked back at Vincenzo over her shoulder. The child's expression was not hostile or hurt, or any of the emotions Vincenzo might have expected. Instead, she looked at him with simple curiosity, the way children observe strangers who exist in their peripheral awareness but hold no particular significance. Then she turned away, reached for her mother's hand, and walked out of the reception hall without a backward glance. Vincenzo stood frozen as they departed, watching Gabriella's elegant figure disappear through the doors with her two daughters. The family he had rejected and forgotten, now walking away from him with the same indifference he had once shown them. Around him, the reception continued with loud music and laughter and celebration, but he felt strangely disconnected from his own triumph. He had invited Gabriella to humiliate her, and instead she had delivered an unexpected lesson simply by existing successfully and contentedly without him. Clarissa appeared at his elbow, her smile bright and her hand possessive on his arm, asking why he looked so distracted at their own wedding reception. Vincenzo forced himself to smile, to return his attention to his new wife and the strategic alliance she represented, to focus on the empire he had built, and the power he commanded. But something had shifted in ways he could not quite articulate, an uncomfortable awareness that revenge could sometimes backfire in subtle but devastating ways. The reception continued late into the night, champagne flowing freely, and his associates becoming progressively louder and more celebratory. Vincenzo played his role perfectly, the triumphant crime boss celebrating his strategic marriage, accepting toasts and congratulations with appropriate grace. But his mind kept returning to Gabriella's calm composure, to those two little girls who looked at him with the indifference of children who had never needed him, to the unwelcome realization that his attempt to demonstrate power had somehow revealed his own profound irrelevance. In the days following the wedding, Vincenzo found himself obsessively researching Gabriella's company. Stellar Occasions was not just successful, it was genuinely elite, commanding fees that rivaled the most established event planning firms in Chicago. Her client list was impressive, her reputation apparently impeccable, her business growing steadily year after year. She had somehow transformed from the unsophisticated woman he had discarded into a respected entrepreneur, moving in circles that intersected with his own criminal empire. More disturbing were the details Vincenzo learned about the twins. They attended Riverside Academy, one of Chicago's most exclusive private schools, the same institution where several of his associates sent their children. They were apparently exceptional students, involved in multiple activities, well-liked by teachers and peers. They lived in Lincoln Park in a restored Victorian home that Gabriella owned outright, no mortgage, purchased 5 years ago for cash. The more Vincenzo learned, the more apparent it became that his ex-wife had built something substantial from the ruins of their marriage. What Vincenzo could not understand was how she had accomplished this transformation. When he divorced her, Gabriella had nothing. She worked for a small catering company making barely above minimum wage. She had no family wealth, no connections, no resources beyond whatever meager savings she might have accumulated. Yet somehow she had gone from that starting point to owning a successful business and raising 2 daughters with every advantage. It offended Vincenzo's sense of order, challenged his belief that people born to nothing would remain nothing without powerful men like him elevating them. His new marriage to Clarissa proceeded according to plan, a strategic alliance that expanded his territory and strengthened his political connections. Clarissa was exactly what she was supposed to be: beautiful, well-connected, content to play the role of crime boss's wife without asking difficult questions or challenging his authority. Their penthouse apartment was showcased in luxury magazines, their social calendar filled with the kind of high-profile events that reinforced Vincenzo's position among Chicago's elite. Everything was unfolding as he had calculated. Yet Vincenzo found himself increasingly distracted by thoughts of Gabriella and the family she had built without him. He drove past her house in Lincoln Park one evening, a restored Victorian with warm lights glowing in the windows, a small garden visible behind an elegant iron fence. Through a window he could see movement, probably Gabriella and the twins engaged in some domestic activity, a tableau of normal family life that existed completely independently of his world. The sight disturbed him in ways he could not articulate. His associates began noticing his distraction. During business meetings, Vincenzo would lose focus, his mind wandering to uncomfortable thoughts about the wedding and Gabriella's unshakable composure. During criminal operations that required his full attention, he found himself preoccupied with the question of how his ex-wife had achieved success that genuinely impressed him, despite his desire to dismiss it. His right-hand man, Antonio, finally pulled him aside and asked directly if something was wrong, if some threat had emerged that required immediate attention. Vincenzo could not explain that he was haunted not by enemies or rival crime families, but by the ghost of a woman he had broken 7 years ago, who had somehow refused to stay broken. He could not admit that his elaborate revenge plan had backfired, by revealing that Gabriella had moved so completely beyond his rejection that his power over her no longer existed. He certainly could not acknowledge that seeing those two little girls, his biological daughters, looking at him with complete indifference, had shaken something fundamental in his understanding of his own importance. 6 months after his wedding, Vincenzo attended a charity gala at the Drake Hotel, a fundraiser for childhood literacy organized by several prominent Chicago families. Clarissa was by his side, dressed in designer fashion, playing her role as his wife with practiced sophistication. The event was crowded with Chicago's power elite, politicians and businessmen and criminals, all mingling under the guise of charitable giving. Vincenzo worked the room with calculated precision, strengthening alliances and reminding certain individuals of obligations they owed him. Halfway through the evening, Vincenzo realized that the event itself was coordinated by stellar occasions. Gabriella's distinctive aesthetic was everywhere, elegant but not ostentatious, sophisticated touches that elevated the gala without overwhelming its purpose. He spotted her across the room, consulting with catering staff, managing the event with calm efficiency, clearly in her element commanding respect from everyone she interacted with. She wore a simple black dress that probably cost thousands, her presence authoritative without being aggressive, her confidence evident in every movement. What made Vincenzo's chest tighten was watching how people responded to Gabriella. Important people, individuals whose respect he had spent years earning through fear and strategic manipulation, approached her with genuine warmth. They thanked her for her work, consulted her opinion on event details, treated her as an equal worth listening to. She had earned their respect through competence and integrity, the same respect Vincenzo commanded through entirely opposite means. Near the end of the evening, Vincenzo found himself standing near the silent auction tables where Gabriella was helping organizers tally bids. He approached with the excuse of examining auction items, though his real purpose was less clear even to himself. Gabriella looked up, recognized him, and offered a professional smile that acknowledged his presence without revealing any personal connection. She was working, focused on her professional obligations, treating him as she would any guest at an event she was coordinating. Vincenzo made some comment about the success of the gala, his words stiff and formal. Gabriella thanked him with genuine pleasure, clearly proud of the event she had organized, explaining that they had already exceeded their fundraising goal and would be able to provide books and literacy programs for thousands of underprivileged children. Her passion for the cause was evident, her satisfaction coming from making a genuine difference rather than from accumulating power or wealth. She was building something meaningful, while Vincenzo spent his days expanding a criminal empire built on violence and corruption. Before Vincenzo could respond, one of the twins appeared at Gabriella's side. The girl was now 7 years old, taller and more assured than when Vincenzo had seen her at his wedding. She'd been attending the gala with her grandmother, who was watching both twins while Gabriella worked, but had come to tell her mother good night before leaving. The child was polite, well-spoken, clearly accustomed to adult gatherings, and comfortable in sophisticated settings. She kissed her mother's cheek, promised to go straight to bed when Grandma got them home, and left without paying Vincenzo any attention whatsoever. The casual dismissal, the complete irrelevance of his presence in that child's awareness, struck Vincenzo more powerfully than any deliberate insult. He was standing 3 feet away from his biological daughter, a child who carried his DNA, and she looked through him as if he were invisible. To her, he was nothing, no one, a stranger who existed only as background noise in her mother's professional environment. 7 years ago, he had told Gabriella that any child she bore was her problem and not his concern. Now he was facing the reality that these children had grown up not needing him, not missing him, not even aware that he should matter. Gabriella excused herself politely, explaining she needed to finalize details with the catering manager. She thanked Vincenzo again for attending the gala, her tone professional and distant, and walked away to attend to her responsibilities. Vincenzo watched her move through the crowd with easy authority, greeting people who clearly respected and valued her, managing an event that was genuinely making a difference in children's lives. She had built something real while he had built something hollow, and the contrast was becoming impossible to ignore. Clarissa appeared at Vincenzo's elbow, slightly drunk on expensive champagne, complaining about how boring charity events were and suggesting they leave early. Vincenzo looked at his wife, beautiful and connected, but ultimately shallow, someone he had married for strategic advantage rather than any genuine connection. He thought about Gabriella raising 2 daughters alone while building a successful business, creating a life filled with purpose and meaning, finding satisfaction in making genuine differences rather than accumulating empty power. The realization that had been building for months crystallized in that moment. Vincenzo had invited Gabriella to his wedding, intending to humiliate her, to demonstrate his superiority, to prove that rejecting her had been the right choice. Instead, she had delivered a lesson he had been too arrogant to anticipate. She had shown him through simple dignity and genuine success that his power over her had ended the moment he walked out 7 years ago. She had built a life so fulfilling and meaningful that his rejection had become irrelevant, transformed from devastating abandonment into unexpected liberation. The twins were proof of her triumph and his loss. He had rejected them as burdens, problems he wanted no part of solving. Gabriella had raised them as blessings, children who gave her life purpose and meaning, who motivated her to build something substantial. Those little girls would grow up knowing their mother's strength and resilience, learning that rejection and hardship could be transformed into motivation for success. They would never know what they had missed by not having Vincenzo as a father, because Gabriella had given them everything they needed without him. In the weeks following the charity gala, Vincenzo found himself increasingly disconnected from his own life. His criminal empire continued operating with ruthless efficiency. His marriage to Clarissa maintained the appearance of success while remaining emotionally hollow. His reputation remained fearsome and his power unchallenged. But something fundamental had shifted in his understanding of what mattered, what constituted genuine success, what would remain after he was gone. He learned more about Gabriella's journey through discreet investigation. After their divorce, she had spent 3 months living with her mother in a 1-bedroom apartment, pregnant with twins, and working 2 jobs to save money. She had started stellar occasions from her mother's kitchen table, coordinating small events for friends and acquaintances, slowly building a reputation for excellence and reliability. She had given birth to the twins, with only her mother present, had returned to work 2 weeks later out of financial necessity, had built her business 1 event at a time while juggling single motherhood and crushing uncertainty. Every step of her success had been earned through work and determination, and refusing to accept that Vincenzo's rejection defined her worth. She had been rejected by the man she loved, abandoned while pregnant, left with nothing but her own resilience and her mother's support. From that devastation, she had built something Vincenzo now recognized as infinitely more valuable than his criminal empire. She had built a life of integrity and purpose, raised children who would make genuine positive contributions to the world, created success that came from lifting others up rather than tearing them down. Vincenzo's wedding revenge had been designed to break Gabriella a second time. Instead, it had revealed that she had moved so completely beyond his rejection that his power over her no longer existed. He had wanted her to witness his triumph and feel diminished. Instead, she had attended with quiet dignity, brought the beautiful daughters he had rejected, and demonstrated through simple presence that she had built something far more meaningful than his strategic marriage and hollow empire. The twins turned 8 years old, celebrated with a party that several of Vincenzo's associates' children attended. Through his network, Vincenzo learned details that should not have mattered to him, but somehow did. The girls were exceptional students. One interested in science and mathematics, the other in literature and art. They volunteered at homeless shelters with their mother. They donated part of their allowance to children's charities. They were being raised to understand that privilege came with responsibility, that success meant lifting others rather than stepping on them. Clarissa announced she was pregnant, news that should have brought Vincenzo satisfaction, but instead filled him with complicated emotions he could not process. He would have another child, this one legitimate and acknowledged, raised with every advantage his wealth and power could provide. But he found himself thinking about the twins growing up without his presence, wondering what they knew about their father, questioning whether they ever asked Gabriella why he had rejected them. His business continued thriving through increasingly violent and ruthless means. Vincenzo eliminated rivals, expanded territories, accumulated wealth and power that made him one of the most feared crime bosses in the Midwest. But late at night, in the empty hours before dawn, he would find himself standing at his penthouse windows, looking out at the city, and thinking about Gabriella and the twins sleeping in their Lincoln Park Victorian, a family that existed in complete independence from his world and influence. The lesson Gabriella had delivered without speaking a single word of accusation or revenge had fundamentally undermined Vincenzo's understanding of power and success. He had believed that rejecting her had been proof of his strength, evidence that he could discard anything that no longer served his ambitions. Instead, her transformation had revealed that true strength came from resilience rather than ruthlessness, that genuine success was measured in meaning and integrity rather than in wealth and fear, that the ability to build something positive from devastating rejection required more courage than commanding a criminal empire. Vincenzo had invited his ex-wife to his wedding, intending to humiliate her. She had arrived with the daughters he rejected and delivered a lesson he would spend the rest of his life trying to understand. She had shown him that his power had limits, that his rejection had not defined her, that she had built something infinitely more valuable than everything he had accumulated through violence and manipulation. The broken woman he remembered no longer existed. In her place stood someone who had transformed his cruelty into catalyst for genuine triumph, his abandonment into motivation for authentic success. And those two little girls, growing up strong and purposeful and loved, were living proof that sometimes the greatest revenge is simply building a life so meaningful and beautiful that the person who tried to destroy you becomes completely irrelevant to your joy and success. Gabriella Torres had done exactly that, and Vincenzo Marcello would spend the rest of his life haunted by the recognition of everything he had lost when he walked away from the only genuine thing he had ever had.